way. Again, my name is Alan Martins. I've been a Microsoft trainer now for about 20 plus years. I won't go into too much background for myself here other than that. Suffice it to say, I've been a Microsoft trainer during that time, a certified trainer during that time, and you name the Microsoft product and I've probably trained it. So Exchange, SQL, etc. What we want to move into today, though, is the webinar series regarding Microsoft Azure, what Microsoft Azure technologies are right for you. There will be, my understanding is that there will be the audio presented or made available after the sometime after this session as well. Probably not immediately, but will be made available shortly, as well as the slides that we have inside here. But the first part of the conversation I wanted to dive into is essentially, and this is where, again, there's probably a fair amount of background already, but Azure, what exactly is it? Why might you be looking at switching? And then going into a discussion on some of the most popular Azure products. I've added a couple of items to it that were included in an email that are not in the slide here as of yet. I may see if I can get a revised form of the slide sent out, made available when they do send it out to you. But we'll be adding a couple of points that I'll add into the conversation as well. But as far as Azure itself, as I said, I'm well aware that a good number of you may already be using Azure, definitely are exploring into it, and by the time you've attended this session here, probably have a good idea what it's for ultimately. But basically, it's one of the cloud services out there, the Microsoft Cloud Service that's out there. And of course, there's a number of movements towards the cloud at this point. So it's a cloud computing service for hosting the various services or virtual machines and applications we might want to place there. As far as why we might be looking at something along those lines, I suppose the biggest benefit to it for a lot of businesses is the upfront cost side of it. Depending on the size of enterprise that you're operating with, you may not have the same kind of investment in the fault tolerance that you might like to have, or you have high availability needs that, again, depending on the size of your business or operation, that you may not have or may not want to put up the same kind of investment into, or at least maybe struggle with some of that investment. So one of the definitely the advantages here is going to be to ease off our upfront cost. Along with that is going to be the infrastructure maintenance. There's not nearly the same kind of investment needed on the hardware, and of course, if you look this way, and you're much more dynamic on being able to increase or decrease that infrastructure. In fact, the building up of that infrastructure, the machines and so on, can also be done very, very rapidly, which does lead into the maintenance and support of it as well, because if you are building up that infrastructure, or rather, I should say, if you have that infrastructure, even if it's virtualized as in here with Azure, the maintenance end of it now is much, much more minimal. Okay, in fact, the maintenance for the most part is taken care of by Microsoft, which would include things like your upgrades or updates that may have to happen. So rather than having your own update procedure and process that you're going to be incorporating on a regular basis internally, this will be handled by Microsoft and the Azure team. The other thing would be depending on the environment that you're working in, would be the skill sets. Now, by that, I don't mean to suggest that you're not going to have, for example, if you're using databases, that you won't have a database administrator on staff, if not multiple administrators, like an entire team of them, but rather you're not going to have as many people on the team that are infrastructure based or architecturally based, yes, but on the infrastructure side and doing all the maintenance work. Your team is also able to much more rapidly move from concept to deployment, okay, because there's not going to be nearly as much on the hardware end to take care of there. Now, as far as and again, that's just scratching the surface as far as why you might be looking at moving into some sort of cloud infrastructure. Now, what can you do with Azure? Two of the main, now this is a very, very broad statement because we're going to be looking at a number of the different resources that they make available, but the biggest areas are, in a broad sense, are going to be services and the virtual machines. When you're looking at infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, well, actually, we'll start with infrastructure as a service since I've mentioned that already. You're not going to have nearly the same kind of need for the support team, right? I mean, as I said, the hardware end of it. You can more dynamically change. You can move things over pretty rapidly from one location to another. You can have a much more distributed environment if you wish to. But in addition to that, with the platform as a service options, now you could be looking at the different, well, even the portability side here, you could have a better development environment. Your cost of ownership, which we kind of touched on, the upfront cost could be eased off a lot as well. So there's going to be a lot of advantages that we can have there. As far as changes or more rapidly being able to deploy or change your design and your methodology could be made a lot more rapidly as well. Now that's just on the services end of it. And with the services, and we'll talk about some of them here like SQL Online, or if you're looking at something else like Cosmos DB, maybe you're looking at the containerized deployment of your applications. So a lot of things are going to be provided by way of services. And what can't be handled through services, you can start to look towards virtual machines. Because if the services themselves aren't offered, then in a worst case environment, you could be building up the virtual machine and deploying your own operating system. Granted, this is where management of your own team is going to have to take place. But you can manage those virtual machines a little more hands-on and then install the appropriate operating system and applications on there. And even in that situation, you have a much more distributed ability to use them, a lot higher fault tolerance options you can pursue, let's say at least more rapidly. And even the storage, as far as the storage locations, where you might want to store and host those virtual machine drives, like the virtual hard disks, or the resources for those disks. What I haven't even touched on is the rapid backup capabilities you might be able to have when you're hosting it in the cloud. Now, along with that, as far as Azure, there's the Azure AD and the Windows 10. One of the things that Azure Active Directory is not the same as your on-premise Active Directory. There will be some changes to it. A simple one, for example, is the whole organizational units and the ability to deploy, again, your configuration files against those organizational units. That's kind of been removed from Azure AD itself. But and when you're looking at computers joining the domains, one of the advantages that Windows 10 offers is that you've got this join via work access feature, which ties in very, very nicely to be able to join into Azure AD itself. Okay. And of course, that would still allow us the whole on-premise capabilities if you've got your Active Directory on-premise. In fact, one of the things that the slide isn't indicating here, but for those of you who may have already been looking into it, Azure AD can become your Active Directory environment for the cloud, or even to measure to a certain extent on-premise. But you could also be looking at it in a more hybrid fashion, possibly with some sort of enterprise scenario with synchronization between your on-premise Active Directory and Azure, or even looking at them being a little more independent and more federated. Either way, Windows 10 does have this work access feature that you can join in. Now, as far as who can be looking at Azure, the fact that you're attending the webinar here already ties into that, but it could be enterprise level use, definitely for development use. In fact, I would expect that both kind of go hand in hand. And additionally, even on a personal level, I mean, anybody can go in and as long as you're willing to use your credit card or you've signed up for some offering where you may be able to get a trial account, you can join up and at the very least start off with a trial account and then move on to use Azure. Again, either enterprise level, corporate level, personal level, anybody could potentially benefit from it. Now, where we want to really dive into, though, when it comes to this is why switch to the cloud, and then what are the features that we've got available to us. So as far as why we might be switching, user-friendly platform. A lot of you use Windows, but there's also going to be a fair amount of Linux machines out there, whether you're hosting databases on them, web servers on them, or other applications. It is a transition that should be intuitive for both. I mean, with the command line alternatives that they've got in there with CLI or PowerShell, if you're looking at more scripted or automated capabilities, you can definitely have support for both Windows and Linux. Capacity, okay, well, capacity, the big point there is, again, it's very, very dynamic, very, very elastic. So if your needs are small or start small, you start there, and you can very, very rapidly, even in a very elastic fashion, if it's just by peak times a day, for example, have it increase to support a larger capacity of your users. whether they're connecting in or whether they're on-premise users, let's say launching a virtual desktop. Compliance, well, again, Microsoft is going to be doing a lot of the maintenance of the machines for you, especially if you're using the services. And so they'll be looking at meeting the various different compliance needs. Cost is, I don't want to say is more controlled, because I do realize that it can be very dynamic depending on demand, but it's a lot more measurable, a lot easier to measure, maybe is a better way to say it. With the various different management and billing options, the way that Microsoft will keep track of it on Azure, you can pull up the statistics on your cost, get an idea of where your bigger costs were, possibly look at leveraging ways to manage that cost more effectively. At the very least, though, you should be able to see a pretty significant cost savings, depending again on the varieties of ways that you might be looking to incorporate either your virtual machines and or services. And then even on the security front. Okay, so it is looking at being more secure. I suppose this is an area where people could very easily get into debates on whether or not it's more secure to keep it on premise and having everybody more siloed, so with your own environments, or going to a central location where there's a lot more investment possible than a lot of individual companies can do on maintaining that security. Okay, I mean, a big push that Microsoft is going to have, of course, is how their management team not only secures your resources, but also how they make sure to even keep their own staffing isolated from your data. So it's definitely designed to be user-friendly and highly secure. You can go hybrid. Again, a lot of you probably are looking at that environment. In fact, I imagine that most companies inevitably will go to some sort of hybrid environment. Even if you are looking, for example, at working on-premise, they have the data backup capabilities into the cloud, which can essentially provide you this disaster recovery options to not only back up your data rapidly, but give you that off-site copy, yet that ease of access on-site as well. As long as you have internet access from the location where you're looking at recovery, you can either try to rebuild your localized box or set up this recovery site fairly rapidly. And in addition to that, of course, the fact that we are putting in the cloud does not negate our need for the security end of it to host it there for us. Now, as far as how the data is going to be safe, they do incorporate the Azure Security Center. Okay, this is, again, Microsoft's environments to maintain that level of security, keep track of your encryption keys, make sure that, of course, what process people can, well, first of all, for your own self-service management of your data, but also in what circumstances and under what conditions you might have somebody from Microsoft go in to support you to try to recover your data. So these might be some of the reasons on switching to the Azure cloud. But what we really wanted to go into today here is the different types of technologies you might be looking at incorporating. And I've got a variety of the more popular technologies that I wanted to go into conversation on. First one, the more obvious one, aside from services, although we will go back to that, is the hosting of virtual machines. And a lot of you may be using virtual machines on-premise, whether or not you're using it through VMware or Hyper-V, but you've got a lot of this private cloud of virtual machines you're looking at hosting. Well, when it comes to using virtual machines in Azure, whether you're looking at a Linux-based box or a Windows-based box, you can create those virtual machines very rapidly. Okay, I know that it says in seconds in the slide. I realize that it could take a little bit longer than that. But with the use of the marketplace, you can pick and choose those virtual machines with the operating systems already pre-canned on it, with certain applications already deployed to it, and essentially use the templates available on, again, something like the marketplace to have a rapid build-up of a machine for you. If you build your own template for a machine, you can, of course, deploy your own rapidly as well. Now, again, they say seconds here. I'm not talking about 4 to 5 seconds in this case, but definitely very, very rapid deployment. I run courses all the time that are using some of the templates off the marketplace. And granted, you may want to do additional tailoring and configuration and, let's say, deployment of specific databases after the fact. But getting the build up quickly with the host application can be very, very rapid. In fact, in addition to that, on that point, the licensing advantages that you can have, you could either utilize your existing licenses if you have them, or incorporate the pricing of the licensing right in the template. So basically pay as you go. And in that case, I believe it's measured to the second as far as your actual payments. So if you're looking at a higher volume of need at certain times of the day, and then other times of the day where you may very well even be shutting the virtual machine off, your payment will reflect that. As far as the workloads that they can support, now if you look at some of the numbers inside here, the pricing will definitely obviously vary based on the resources you choose to use. But when you're picking the size of your virtual machine, as you can see, your workloads can hit hardware, resources up to 128 virtual CPUs, 6 terabytes of memory, okay, 3.7 million local storage IOs per second, and that's per virtual machine. And if you look at the bandwidth, as you can see, you can have set up to use a very, very high level of bandwidth. Those of you who may have attended Microsoft courses, those trial accounts, don't utilize this kind of levels, obviously, because you'd have to keep the cost down off that trial little budget that they give you as far as the trial account. But if your needs push the higher ends, again, you can pick and choose the virtual machine and the resources that can offer that to you. Obviously, you're going to be paying for your usage and your needs, so the pricing will be adjusted to reflect it. But you're able to broaden or branch out to some fairly heavy workloads. As far as keeping existing applications, now this goes in a couple different directions. Since we're talking virtual machines here, that's really where the focal point is. As I pointed out, there are some services, and I mentioned a couple like SQL Online, Exchange Online, etc., that Microsoft does offer as a service directly. But whether you have existing applications that are incorporated as a service, you could choose to go that route if you wish. Or if your needs, either from a security and maintenance standpoint or even functionality standpoint, because not all applications would be able to be hosted as a service, at least not presently, you should be able to run them effectively within a virtual machine instead, especially when you see the workload resource levels that we can support. So definitely companies like Microsoft, Oracle, IBM, SAP, just to name a couple, of course, you could be looking at the virtual machine route. Another direction that you might take it will be your Azure SQL database. Now, I've already mentioned Azure, or rather SQL Online, as an option that you can go with. Well, as part of that usage, now if you have existing database servers, maybe SQL would probably be the easiest in this case, there is the ability to migrate it into Azure. Now, as I pointed out here, frictionless migration. The whole idea being is that you don't have to change any of the environment that you have as far as the coding and the structure, but instead you can, with this managed instance, you can migrate it into Azure Online. Now, I don't want to suggest that there's absolutely no adjustments that would need to be made. For example, if you're using various different login accounts with SQL, if that's what you're using on-premise, for example, they don't support the login accounts the same way. So you'd have to do, there will be a bit of a migration process there. But it is designed to be very flexible, move it into the cloud. And as we pointed out before, since it's running as a service in that case, the maintenance of it, the patching of it, would be handled by Microsoft instead. So it would streamline that part to you. You could also go into more of a hybrid environment as well, in case you want to operate with your SQL Server both on-premise and in the cloud. Maybe, for example, the cloud instance is more of your fallback. So maybe you do want to run it on-premise, but you are looking at, if I look at the second or third bullet here, when sorry about that. When you are talking things about the high availability end of it, we could, of course, support it either through a series of machines, maybe again the one on-premise, one in the cloud, or multiple instances in the cloud. You can scale it fairly rapidly, and not just multiple machines, but multiple locations, multiple regions. Geographically redundant regions, for example. As a good example, now I don't know where everybody is located, but there are a number of regions, 2 in Canada, for example, and I believe there's at least 4, no, there's going to be more than that in the US. There's about 29 regions, I think, overall right now. So there's a number of regions where you could be hosting these machines on that scalability. As far as, again, broadening to it. Now, they also mentioned, or I've got on the slide here, the built-in machine learning. Okay, and this is, if you're looking at boosting your performance, looking at some of the auto tuning, gaining some insights to what's actually happening in your environment that could be causing some of the disrupted performance or poor performance. You can try to look at improving on it. I mentioned the scalability and the high availability, but there's also the advanced data security. And with that, we're looking at more the encryption, for example. One of the things that's often a concern by somebody is, okay, I'm hosting my data in the cloud. Does that mean that my data is exposed to Microsoft, for example? Well, you can identify things you want to have always encrypted, so that way when it's being transmitted into the cloud, it's encrypted from your location on premise through the cloud. And then, of course, when you pull it back down, you perform the decryption on your end. Without going into the full details of it, there are variations on the way that encryption may take place. Some will improve your searching more effectively, while others will, this is a natural trade-off here, but will maybe not search as easily, but have a higher level of protection on the encryption. For example, randomized encryption. So that way the same values can't be indexed. But because they can't be indexed, they also have a lot higher level of security to them. So this is, again, with Azure SQL database. Now, as far as, let me just jump forward here. There's also the Azure Cosmos DB. A lot of you might be looking at much larger environments. I mean, data warehousing, big data, storage of information. Well, the Azure Cosmos DB is, as you can see here, this fully managed database service offered by or hosted by Microsoft. Now, the advantage, of course, is that because this is with Azure, this point on turnkey global distribution, well, yes, we've got 29 plus regions out there. And so you could distribute your data throughout those regions. Now, you will have to pick and choose exactly how you want your high availability to operate, but as you can see, you have this single-digit millisecond high availability measurements. I mean, as you can see, 99.999% high availability. But again, it is turnkey as well, so as far as deploying this large environment, you can move into it fairly rapidly. I've already mentioned elasticity with regards to resources on previous comments, both with virtual machines and SQL Online. Same thing in this case is true here. I do love the claim of unlimited scalability. I'm going to qualify that slightly. Obviously, that's maybe a little bit of an exaggeration in the sense that if we go by as far as the technicality, I mean, no matter what, even Microsoft has a maximum size that they've built their cloud. But for all intents and purposes, on a corporate level, we're not going to be hitting the maximum level that Microsoft could support. So in that respect, the claim of unlimited scalability, I suppose, would hold true. Not to mention that if the demand was there, they'd be increasing the resources that they would be offering as well. So ultimately, it would move, let's say, at least towards that direction, towards the unlimited scalability. The nice thing is, though, it's also elasticized. So the resource needs can grow with you, or if you have peak and non-peak times, you could be looking at retracting that resource demand to again keep your costs down and make sure that the user experience with regards to interact with the data or your application's experience would be consistent. Multi-model with wire protocol compatible API endpoints. What we're really looking at there is, regardless of where somebody would be trying to connect into this environment, you can have endpoints scattered through, worldwide to make sure that for connectivity to your Cosmos DB. Real-time analytics, that you'd be able to get feedback on what's actually taking place here, getting again from your resource hits. Again, a good way of being able to very rapidly respond if, let's say, there is a higher need and you haven't set it up to be, let's say, as dynamic, because you could choose to manage, let's say, the ranges of that elasticity, that scalability, or you may leave it a little more open-ended. Open-ended, of course, gives you a little bit less control on maybe your exact cost, so you might be looking at controlling a bit further. But in either case, you can get this real-time analytics to give some feedback on the demand that you really have, the resources consumed, and give you some more hands-on, I suppose, control over your cost model with that as well. So that's your Azure Cosmos DB. A lot of you, though, when you're looking at scalability, other than the virtual machines themselves, you may also be looking at scalability or virtualization on a container level. A lot of you either may already have incorporated various containers through through VMware or Hyper-V. Maybe you've already been rolling your containers out into the Windows environment as well. Well, Azure Kubernetes Service, now it is one of the operators with regards to Microsoft's Azure Container Service as a whole. And when we are talking about the Azure Container Service, this is Microsoft's implementation to help support the various different operators that you might be looking at. Now, Kubernetes is one of them. Docker would be Docker Swarm technology would be another. So they are all being supported. But when it comes to the Kubernetes service, as you can see again, elastic provisioning. In this case, it's for the resource use of your containers themselves, which can, thankfully, and again, the point here I made is event-driven auto-scaling. Yeah, it's going to be reacting to demand. If you've got an instance of an application running in a container and you want to launch, you want to be able to scale upwards and offer more offerings so you can have more concurrent users, it can automatically fire up and provide those additional containers. When it comes to end-to-end development, well, because we have the containerized service, we virtualize essentially the application itself. Sorry, let me rephrase that. We virtualize the operating system itself because the container is going to be utilizing that same hosted operating system environment while still running in their own little, I'll use the word bubble here, but their own little bubble or world with regards to configuration settings, a lot of the registry options, maybe certain drivers or link libraries, for example, which does give us, when it comes to the development side of it, gives us a lot of advantages too. Because now you can build this nice little containerized environment and you can swap this container into production. For example, you could have a container that you're operating with that you're doing your development in, doing your testing in, and when you're ready, you can just swap it into your production environment. Now, the beauty of that is that I could have one that is still live under production while I am currently working on updating and revising a new release, let's say, of the application, and then could more rapidly transition it from development to production. As far as the tools involved, I made a list of a couple of the tools, but again, this is a broad Azure conversation. So yes, Visual Studio tools. There's the Azure DevOps. Some of you may have been looking into the various Azure courses that Microsoft has on offer already as far as the development side of things. And then Azure Monitor to watch what's happening with regards to our containers. Again, their resource hit, the environment, is anything operating, I suppose, suboptimally in its behavior. Advanced identity and access management with dynamic rules enforcement across multiple clusters. Well, this is where, because again, we're looking at things on a containerized level and virtualizing the operating system, we still want to have a very, very high level of fault tolerance. And so we need to be able to fail over from one host, for example, to another host. And what these rules here are to help us out with is to, again, when the failover, or if the failover was supposed to take place, again, we always hope we're not going to be dealing with that, but when it does potentially take place, that we can fairly rapidly have it fire up and still maintain somebody's identity as far as the login, confirm that they're legitimate, regardless of which cluster that they may be redirected to. Now here I did actually make a list of the 29 plus regions. Again, you want to coordinate those containers across those regions, you can do that. And again, your operating system itself is what you're essentially virtualizing at this stage. Now, because I don't know the business that everybody here is connecting in, there's a number of other areas that are very popular with regards to Azure as well. One of them being cognitive services. Here. Cognitive services. And as you can see, it's when you want to look at your apps, website, possibly bots, and you want to have, let's say, more of an automated or support infrastructure in place as far as be able to react to user communications. Maybe these days with social media tends to be a big part of it. People tend to be using that. You may want to be able to respond to feedback that's being given about your business, or you want to be able to support some sort of Q&A environment where there can be an interactive environment between your users and your corporate environment as well. And so a lot of the cognitive services that we're looking at here are, so you can build apps that can help with decision making. This again, now obviously that's going to happen based on information that it's going to have collected, but designing these applications to be much more, I want to hesitate to use the word intuitive, but definitely to be able to work off of the data that it's receiving, to be able to make a good decision, or let's say an accurate decision in response to whatever the feedback is or the app's behavior is. Speech. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if every one of you, or at least the majority of you, have on multiple occasions interacted with some sort of online help tool, maybe it's phone-based, that was converting your speech into text, or maybe your text into some naturalist sounding speech, even including language translation from, let's say, German to English, or English to German, or any variation of languages. The interesting thing is that these days, some of these things have evolved to the point where a lot of people they're not even aware that they're not speaking to an actual person, because of the way how accurate the conversion already is becoming. So this is part of the cognitive services. Language, to process natural language with pre-built scripts. A number of you have possibly already been looking at deploying things onto the various dashboards, maybe using things like tools like Power BI, or with Azure's dashboards, and publishing a lot of information there as well. And a lot of the Q&A sections now provide this natural language support. So again, allowing a person to type in the question, or in this case, possibly just address it through speech, and have it use that to evaluate what the real requirements are, or desires are. Vision, recognize, identify, caption, index, moderate pictures, videos, digital ink content. Now this is a big one, because moderating pictures and videos has always historically been the part of the awkward side of moderating your environments. And it's far too easy. In fact, spammers used to love using pictures, especially as ways of circumventing your anti-spamming tools, for example. Well, now you can use the cognitive services here to help, again, moderate the pictures, to watch for the kind of content, evaluate that picture. Videos as well, okay, just to make sure that we're not getting any kind of content that's inappropriate, either being posted by, let's assume by the public, I would hope not by staff, but definitely to catch this information. And then also to use search, granted this Microsoft, so we're looking at the Bing search app, East Your Apps, to help search through your applications themselves, or to possibly incorporate search within your apps that can then utilize the Bing search mechanics to search through the internet as well for supporting material. So this is where the cognitive services may come into play. Another additional area is Windows Virtual Desktop, deploying and scaling virtualized Windows desktops and apps on Azure. Okay, maybe you're trying to support a lot of end users. So, I mean, a lot of businesses these days have started to be much more fluid. They're dynamic. You move from your users, for example, maybe they work from home on occasion, maybe they travel and they're operating on the road. Maybe you want to have a much more flexible workplace environment for where they sit, where they position themselves. And you're looking at, let's say, more, let's say, neutral hardware that you're using in on-premise, and instead having the users connect in and use virtualized Windows desktops and apps within Azure itself. I remember, well, okay, I won't go into details on some of my other experiences here, but I have dealt with environments where the clients were deploying fresh images to their staffing because they was on a shift. So there was a 24-hour shift, and every 8 hours, all the existing virtual machines would, of course, be shut down, and a different set would be fired up. Same hardware is being used by staff, so they could sit pretty much where they wish to, and they would recover their own environment from the previous day. And we would be, because it's all virtualized here through Azure, it's not about, at least at this point, it would not be so much about deploying these virtualized images, but rather being able to connect into them instead. With Azure, the only multi-session Windows Virtual Desktop experience. Okay, now that's a Windows Virtual Desktop experience. I don't know how many of you have played with the Windows 10 and been able to switch around the virtual desktops. but with Azure, there is support, of course, for that. Now, I do want to qualify that point slightly. I do realize that stating it's the only multi-session Windows virtual desktop experience, yes, that's as far as the Windows environment itself. Okay, and this is Windows Virtual Desktop. Now, that could be incorporated, as I said, within the cloud through our virtual machines. Okay, you may even decide to have your on-premise users have this virtual desktop switch as well, so they could be using these virtual machines on one desktop and switch to a more localized desktop on the other. So that's a little bit of a cross point, though, between, let's say, Windows 10 and Azure in that case. Optimizations for Office 365 Pro Plus. Now, I'm guessing that a fair number of you may have various Office packages or subscriptions, and there's optimizations here to support that as well, as far as being able to utilize that information at least, and optimizing the use of Office 365. Now, don't get me wrong, part of that has to do with the fact that when you're logging into Azure, it can be the same account that you connected to with Office 365, so this has all been streamlined to give you this access. Plus, we're already communicating to the cloud, and so there is that connection with Office 365. And this migrating remote desktops and apps to Azure, maybe I'll put a not a disclaimer, but a broader statement. I mean, obviously, if a company like Microsoft and Azure are looking to bring people into the cloud, they're going to want to make that as easy a transition as possible. So the option of migrating remote desktops and apps to Azure, they're definitely going to be looking at ways to streamline that for you, helping you with the plan to do that and make it as clean as possible. Plus, when you're looking at deploying a new virtual desktop, the ability to deploy it and scale it for your users within minutes, which kind of harkens back to the comment I made a little while ago about this company that may be operating on a 3-shift schedule with different staffing on each shift, using the same hardware, and all we'd have to do is connect them into a different set of virtual machines, and we could have scaled out rapidly, especially if this, let's say, was a new project, or you had to open up a couple of new machines for some contract workers, or possibly even quick, sudden, unexpected hiring of staffing. Then there's the app service. If you're looking at hosting your own applications, especially if you do a lot of in-house development, now you can build, deploy, and scale your web apps very, very rapidly through Azure. Now, I've made a list of a number of the languages. You probably would have expected these ones to be supported anyway, especially the whole .NET environment, this obviously being a Microsoft product. But as you can see here, if you're looking at web apps using Java, Node.js, Python, PHP, Ruby, all of these are going to be supported here as well. So as far as being able to build up and deploy those applications, you can do that fairly rapidly. And the nice thing is that we've been talking about the virtual machines, and you could be deploying them to those virtual machines, but what you might find even more effective is deploy them within the containers. We mentioned the Kubernetes service and the whole Azure container service support for Docker and establishing our containers. Well, we could deploy these applications or this app service through those same containers. Or as you can see, as code running on a Linux or Windows-based platform. Now, don't get me wrong, if we're looking at a Linux or a Windows platform, we could be looking at the hosting of the virtual machine. If you're looking at deploying the container, they will be a little bit more, pardon the play on words here, but self-contained. And again, so you can deploy them very, very rapidly. And scalability too, don't get me wrong. If you're looking at your application to be more scalable, you could do that, as well as running applications that might normally be in conflict with each other. You don't have to worry about that type of conflict. One of the prime ones that people tend to always think about in-house that I could kind of tie an example to is supporting multiple versions of Office product, for example. Historically, that would tend to be a problem. By way of the containers, that would not be an issue. Now, because we'd also be looking at the app service and deploying our web apps directly rather than hosting a whole web server, for example, the maintenance and load balancing of it would be handled again by Azure. As it points out here, 0 downtime deployments. We don't have to worry about the virtual machine with our web server being up and running if we're deploying it here through the app service. It's going to be more a matter of choosing the region where you want to host this or host instances of it and deploying it there. Again, the maintenance of the platform, not our responsibility. That'd be what Microsoft would take care of. They also tied into this enterprise-grade global data center network. Well, I mentioned Azure AD earlier. Well, if you're using Azure AD, and I tied this already to the fact that you might be also using an on-premise version of Active Directory, we can synchronize or keep a single sign-on environment from our on-premise through the cloud. So the hosting of our applications and the authentication and then an ability to interact with the applications, we can be crossing from the public cloud to the private cloud or private to public, operating on virtual network, complete on-premise environment as well. The user doesn't have to be aware that given applications are running in any one of these areas. Now, a very, very attentive user might recognize, if you've run it in the past on-premise, they may recognize just the slightest of, I guess, lag in the sense of there is the bouncing to the internet and back, but your users should really notice that kind of a thing and move back and forth. In fact, even on-premise, we like the flexibility of perhaps moving it from machine to machine anyway if we start doing some sort of load balancing. Now it's simply that we're allowing that load balancing type environment as well as the multi-tiered style environment to go well beyond our on-premise environment. Okay, now this is one I don't know. I'm going to just hit this one lightly, but do please by all means look into it. I don't know if anybody who's connecting is involved in the building and operating of live games. There is PlayFab is another very, very popular service through Azure, in case you were curious. So back-end gaming services, support for it, building games for any of the platforms, game engines, or devices, engaging with players through live ops, and even optimizing with real-time analytics. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here with it directly, but as I guess I'm not with any one technology, but this also is supported with Microsoft. It is a very, very popular platform out there. So as far as the building up of games and the analytics and managing those games. And for those of you who are gamers on your own as well, don't be surprised if some of the games that you might enjoy playing are being hosted over on Azure. Because as they pointed here, you can build games for any platform, game engine, or device, and support it ultimately in backend. Azure Functions. You're looking at something that is more, and I love the fact that we go into the serverless environment. In fact, a lot of times when we start thinking about virtualization and we start talking about the virtual machines that I pointed out, the virtual nature of the operating system, we start looking at containers, is also the ability to use Azure Functions. Now, it's an event-driven. I love the fact that it's serverless, okay, because it's be able to react to different events that are taking place. Now, this could be something based on some of your virtual machines. It could be based on some kind of deployment or debugging that's taking place. But with these Azure Functions, as you can see, you can deploy and operate them and scale them as far as the cloud-based use. And because they are event-driven, they could fire based on different events that are being triggered or captured in the cloud. So as you can see, there's an integrated model based on triggers and bindings for what programming you want to, let's say, execute in reaction to, let's say, another virtual machine being fired up, or a virtual machine having some difficulty, or a service failing. So as you can see, it can be definitely scaled. Automated and flexible scaling based on workload. Well, this is again based on demand. We talked about the elasticity of our resources. Even the Azure Functions do support that type of flexibility and scaling. End-to-end development, so both building, debugging, deploying, and monitoring these functions. Okay, and as far as the languages you can operate this in, now I didn't make a list of all the languages, but we had that on a previous slide. Okay, so if you are looking at building up some of your own Azure Functions and wanting to be able to respond or react to what's happening there, you could take a look at any one of a number of languages. Obviously, we'd be thinking about the .NET, but when you start talking about PHP and Python and so on, we also have those available to us. When you want to connect to or respond to the Internet of Things, okay, you've got your IoT devices. You may want to be able to react to different behaviors. You could be looking at, again, some of your Azure Functions to support that. The Azure Blockchain Service. Now, I don't know how distributed everybody's environments here may be, but you might be looking at hosting pieces of your of an application's execution in multiple different locations. And so Microsoft does try to work, and this is a very, very popular kind of service that's with Azure, is to build, govern, and expand these blockchain networks. So when you have pieces of your infrastructure, sorry, let's not say infrastructure, pieces of your applications operating in different environments, and of course you need to network them all together. And when I say different network environments here, I'm not just talking Azure, it could be spread out beyond Azure. And so you want to be able to bring this all in. A good example might be, let's say something that's multi-corporation. So you have your supplier or manufacturer, and you have your shipper tied to it. And you want to be able to, as part of this overall movement of data and movement of activities, be able to move it from one network to another. So between the corporations. Now, as you can see, you could deploy this kind of environment. Now, again, I say a few simple clicks. Obviously, there's going to be a process behind it to make sure it's set up. You're going to have to make sure that the proper trust is available throughout that network. But once you've got this set up, as you can see, you can govern it at scale. There's this built-in governance, codeless consortium management. And this is, again, so that the different entities involved or members involved can work together on it. And, of course, oversee their part of that chain. You can offload the blockchain network management, and as I mentioned, you're built with confidence using various tools and apps. Now, we are talking about tools and apps that would be provided within Azure with the various development tools. The data sources you could be leveraging could be any one of the ones that we've been speaking about already, in this case with Azure. Okay, now I did say that there was a couple of additional points I wanted to make a bit of a reference to that weren't in here, but I do believe may have been listed in the email, and that is something like Event Grid. Excuse me, Event Grid as well. And this is really where we're looking at multiple data sources and event handlers, and we need to be able to, I suppose tied similar to the functions there, we want to be able to react to various different events that are taking place. Okay, and the event grid's job is going to be to manage those events, because there may be way too many events coming in at a time to be able to handle all of them on that instance. So the event grid's job is going to be to catch these and then to properly hand off or trigger the corresponding events. Okay. And so you may have various event information coming in. Again, maybe an application has triggered it. The event grid will capture it, and then because it's holding on to it, it can then direct it to the appropriate logic app, which is another part of our conversation here, as far as some sort of a workflow we might want to process, and do it in a reliable fashion. Because again, we've talked about scalability. Well, maybe our applications haven't scaled yet. They're just in the process of doing so because we're hitting this peak time. And so the event grid's job is going to be to coordinate that passing of this event. And to do that without loss, so to make it reliable. Another thing might be the messaging side of it. So this kind of an event grid is really just a part of messaging. So here you could be looking at things like the Azure storage queues, where information will be queued up. Again, maybe it's because the target location that's supposed to receive this message is unavailable at the moment. Maybe it's already processing some other workload, and so this way it can grab off that queue when it's able to, or perhaps you've scaled up the application at this point, peak time is being hit. And so an additional one pulls, I guess I should really say, dequeues an item that's been placed on that queue so that it can react to it. A good example, again, would be an application that's simply been triggered for some reason, waiting for information. It's being sent off to another application to be processed, and now it's in a wait moment because the application that needs this isn't quite ready. A couple moments later, it finally is, and it's able to grab that message. So it is designed for that purpose. Or the Azure Service Bus, okay, which now allows you to perhaps, rather than looking too much about something being fully event-driven, maybe we need to schedule certain behaviors, schedule certain actions, maybe firing certain applications. And so we could be looking at the scheduling of it. Or maybe we're doing some transactional processing between data sources, and we want to make sure, again, that it's an all-or-nothing type transaction. Or expiring certain messages because the time to live has been expired. but also to make sure that in the whole process of all these messages being fired and queued, that we also make sure that we don't deliver the same message multiple times, or rather, I should say, we don't have the same one being executed multiple times, okay, when it should have only been executed once. So in other words, duplicate detection. I mentioned about event grids already. Okay, and then the logic apps is one of the points I wanted to make into as well. If you're looking at setting up your own little workflow, Microsoft does support various logic apps, so you can create those processes, put those processes in place, develop those workflows, and thankfully you don't have to do it from the coding level. I'm guessing some of you have either yourselves or your staffing has set up workflows for you in the past as well. These aren't all programmatic. You can do a lot of it visually instead. I realize the mindset's still programmatic in nature, but it's be able to visually set up that workflow and integrate that workflow with minimal code and integrate it with things like your apps or your app services, your virtual machines and cloud offerings, possibly third-party, definitely tying it to something like Office 365, communication, or other software as a service offerings. Okay, that's really the high points of the various different technologies we're going to be looking at. I don't know if there's if the Q&A has probably been set up here so you can fire off your questions, but I do know that the webinar is going to be made available, at least the audio is going to be made available again at some point, and I believe the PowerPoint slides are going to be sent out as well. So that really concludes the session here I was going to be offering. And if there are any questions, I'm sure you have contacts that you can fire this to. Hold on, I think I've got a message or two here. Okay, Al, I don't know if you're still here. I wasn't touching on the Azure stack itself. It was not something I had brought into play here directly. If you're looking for something on that, I could probably grab it for you here fairly quickly. Maybe what I'll do is I'll talk to Alex and see if I can pass something through there to maybe get it included. Yeah, no, not a problem. I've already got some people dropping off, so that's why I'll try to do it that way. Sorry, I didn't watch the chat questions too much directly because I was expecting as many as 120 people, and it would have been difficult to cover that too easily in the webinar directly. But I will talk to Alex about trying to incorporate something like that. Okay, no problem, Samar. Yeah, if there's any questions anybody does have here, just briefly, I may not be able to cover it here directly because a lot of people will be slipping away here pretty quick. But what I might see if I can do is if I can talk to Alex about possibly trying to get something like that included or made available with the video, or sorry, with the audio. Okay. Well, other than that, hopefully the webinar here will have been informative for some of you on some of the things that Azure is bringing to the table. Hopefully some of the technologies that were mentioned are things that you might find beneficial, at least to explore in the short term and possibly to incorporate in the long term. So I do hope that that'll help in some of that decision making. Okay, so thank you. And I do hope everybody enjoys the balance of your day.